Hi, boys and girls. I'm going to continue reading because of Winn-Dixie. When we left off, Winn-Dixie had just met Miss Franny, who was the librarian, and Miss Franny was spooked by Winn-Dixie because she thought Winn-Dixie was a bear when Winn-Dixie was peeking in the window, in the library window. Miss Franny thought that Winn-Dixie was a bear. And then Miss Franny had an experience where a bear actually did come in the library, so she says, and India Opal is saying, I love stories. Will you tell me the story of when that happened? So that's where we left off, and I'm going to read chapter 7. Back when Florida was wild, when it consisted of nothing but pimento trees and mosquitoes so big they could fly away with you, Miss Franny Block started in, and I was just a little girl no bigger than you. My father, Herman W. Block, told me that I could have anything I wanted for my birthday. Anything at all. Miss Franny looked around the library. She leaned in close to me. I don't want to appear prideful, she said, but my daddy was a very rich man. A very rich man. She nodded, then leaned back and said, and I was a little girl who loved to read. So I told him, I said, Daddy, I would most certainly love to have a library for my birthday. A small little library would be wonderful. You asked for a whole library? A small one, Miss Franny nodded. I wanted a house full of nothing but books, and I wanted to share them too. And I got my wish. My father built me this house, the very one we are sitting in now. And at a very young age, I became a librarian. Yes, ma'am. What about the bear? I said. Did I mention that Florida was wild in those days? Miss Franny Block said. Uh-huh, you did. It was wild, and there were wild men and wild women and wild animals, like bears. Yes, ma'am, that's right. Now I have to tell you, I was a little Miss Know-It-All. I was a Miss Smarty Pants with my library full of books. Oh, yes, ma'am. I thought I knew the answers to everything. Well, one hot Thursday, I was sitting in my library with all the doors and windows open and my nose stuck in a book when a shadow crossed the desk. And without looking up, yes, ma'am, without even looking up, I said, Is there a book I can help you find? Well, there was no answer, and I thought it might have been a wild man or a wild woman, scared of all these books and afraid to speak up. But then I became aware of a very peculiar smell, a very strong smell. I raised my eyebrows slowly, and standing right in front of me was a bear. Yes, ma'am, a very large bear. How big? I asked. Oh, well, said Miss Franny, perhaps 3 times the size of your dog. Then what happened? I asked her. Well, said Miss Franny, I took him and I looked at him and he looked at me. He put his big nose up in the air and sniffed as if he was trying to decide if a little Miss Know-It-All librarian was what he was in the mood to eat. And I sat there. And then I thought, well, if this bear intends to eat me, I'm not going to let it happen without a fight. No, ma'am. So very slowly and very carefully I raised up the book I was reading. What book was that? I asked. Why, it was War and Peace, a very large book. I raised it up slowly, and then I aimed it carefully, and I threw it right at the bear and screamed, Be gone! And you know what? No, ma'am, I said. He went. But this was what I will never forget. He took the book with him. Nuh-uh, I said. Yes, ma'am, said Miss Franny. He snatched it up and ran. Did he come back? I asked. No, I never saw him again. Well, the men in this town used to tease me about it. They used to say, Miss Franny, we saw that bear of yours out in the woods today. He was reading that book, and he said it was sure good, and it would be all right if he kept it would it be all right if he kept it for just another week? Yes, ma'am. They did tease me about it, she sighed. I imagine I'm the only one left from those days. I imagine I'm the only one that even recalls the bear. All of my friends, everyone I knew when I was young, they are all dead and gone. She sighed again. She looked old and sad and wrinkled. It was the same way I felt sometimes, being friendless in a new town and not having a mama to comfort me. I sighed too. Winn-Dixie raised his head off his paws and looked back and forth between me and Miss Franny. He sat up and then showed Miss Franny his teeth. Well now, look at that, she said. That dog is smiling at me. It's a talent of his, I told her. It is a fine talent, Miss Franny said, a very fine talent. And she smiled back at Winn-Dixie. We could be friends, I said to Miss Franny. You and me and Winn-Dixie, we could all be friends. Miss Franny smiled even bigger. Why, that would be grand, she said, just grand. And right at that moment, right when the three of us had decided to be friends, who should come marching into the Herman W. Block Memorial Library but an old, pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. She walked right up to Miss Franny's desk and said, I finished Johnny Tremaine, and I enjoyed it very much. I would like something more difficult to read now because I am an advanced reader. Yes, dear, I know, said Miss Franny. She got up out of her chair. Amanda pretended like I wasn't there. She stared right past me. Are dogs allowed in the library? She asked Miss Franny as she walked away. Certain ones, said Miss Franny. A select few. And then she turned around and winked at me. I smiled back. I had just made my first friend in Naomi, and nobody was going to mess that up for me, not even old pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. It's the end of chapter 7. We're meeting lots of characters in this book. We're going to read chapter 8. Winn-Dixie's bald spots started growing fur, and the fur that he had to begin with started looking shiny and healthy, and he didn't limp anymore. And you could tell that he was proud of looking so good, proud of not looking like a stray. I thought what he needed most was a collar and a leash. So I went to Gertrude's Pets, where there were fish and snakes and mice and lizards and gerbils and pet supplies, and I found a real handsome red leather collar with a matching leash. Winn-Dixie was not allowed to come inside the store. There was a big sign on the door that said, "No dogs allowed." So I held the collar and the leash up to the window, and Winn-Dixie, who was standing on the other side of the window, pulled up his lip and showed me his teeth and sneezed and wagged his tail something furious. So I knew he absolutely loved the leash and collar combination, but it was very expensive. I decided to explain my situation to the man behind the counter. I said, I don't get big enough allowance to afford something this fancy, but I love this collar and leash, and so does my dog. And I was thinking that maybe you could set me up on an installment plan. Installment plan, said the man. Gertrude, somebody screamed in a real irritated voice. I looked around. It was a parrot. She was sitting on top of one of the fish tanks looking right at me. An installment plan, I said, ignoring the parrot. You know, where I promised to give you my allowance every week and you give me the leash and the collar now. I don't think I can do that, said the man. He shook his head. No, the owner. She wouldn't like that. He looked down at the counter. He wouldn't look at me. He had thick black hair and it was slicked back like Elvis Presley's. He had on a name tag that said Otis. Or I could work for you, I said. I could come in and sweep the floors and dust the shelves and take out the trash. I could do that. I looked around Gertrude's Pets. There was sand and sunflower seed shells and big dust bunnies all over the floor. I could tell that it needed to be swept. Oh, said Otis. He looked down at the counter some more. Gertrude, the parrot screamed again. I'm real trustworthy, I said. I'm new in town, but my daddy is a preacher. He's the preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, so I'm real honest. But the only thing is, Winn-Dixie, my dog, he would have to come inside with me because if we get separated for too long, he starts to howl something terrible. Gertrude doesn't like dogs, said Otis. Is she the owner, I asked. Yes, no, he finally looked up and pointed at the fish tank. That Gertrude, the parrot, I named her after the owner. Gertrude's a pretty bird, screamed Gertrude. She might like Winn-Dixie, I told Otis. Almost everybody does, maybe. He could come inside and meet her. If the two of them get along, then maybe I could have the job. Maybe, Otis mumbled. He looked down at the counter again. So I went and opened the door, and Winn-Dixie came trotting on inside the store. Dog, screamed Gertrude. I know it, Otis. I know it, Otis told her, and then Gertrude got real quiet. She sat on the top of the fish tank and cocked her head from one side to the other, looking at Winn-Dixie, and Winn-Dixie stood and stared back at her. He didn't hardly move. He didn't wag his tail, he didn't smile, he didn't sneeze, he just stared at Gertrude, and she stared at him. And then she spread her wings out real far and flew and landed on top of Winn-Dixie's head. "Dog!" she croaked. Can you imagine what a dog would do? Winn-Dixie wagged his tail just a tiny bit, and Otis said, "You can start on Monday." "Thank you," I told him. "You won't be sorry." On the way out of Gertrude's Pets, I said to Winn-Dixie, "You are better at making friends than anybody I've ever known. I bet if my mama knew you, she would think you were the best dog ever." Winn-Dixie was smiling up at me, and I was smiling down at him. And so neither of us was looking where we were going, and we almost bumped right into Sweetie Pie Thomas. She was standing there, sucking on her knuckle of the third finger, staring in the window of Gertrude's Pets. She took her finger out of her mouth and looked at me. Her eyes were all big and round. "Was that bird sitting on that dog's head?" she asked. She had her hair tied up in a ponytail with a pink ribbon. But it wasn't much of a ponytail. It was mostly ribbon and a few strands of hair. "Yes," I told her. "I seen it," she said. She nodded her head and put her knuckle back in her mouth. Then she took it out again real quick. "I seen that dog in church too. He was catching a mouse. I want a dog just like it, but my mama won't let me get no dog," she said. "If I'm real good, I might get to buy me a goldfish or one of them gerbils. That's what she says." "Can I pet your dog?" "Sure," I told her. Sweetie Pie stroked Winn-Dixie's head so long and serious that his eyes drooped, half closed, and drool came out of the side of his mouth. "I'm going to be 6 years old in September." "I gotta stop sucking on my knuckle once I'm 6, said Sweetie Pie. "I'm having a party. Do you want to come to the party? The theme is pink." "Sure," I told her. "Can this dog come?" she asked. "You bet," I told her. And all of a sudden I felt happy. I had a dog, I had a job, I had Miss Franny Block for a friend, and I had my first invitation to a party in Naomi. It didn't matter if that came from a 5-year-old and the party wasn't until September. I didn't feel lonely anymore. And that's the end of chapter 8. We'll read chapter 9 next time. Thanks.